Okay, maybe I think we start because it's 12:02, well 11:02 in Indonesia, and we kick it off, and let's see if more people join. They can join in between. But thank you everyone who have joined us. I think we have a very exciting panel discussion in front of us with very exciting panelists today. So what I'll do is I'll introduce the panelists briefly. First of all, we have from Government of Indonesia, from Kalhaka, Ministry of Environment and Forestry, Ibu Nia, the Deputy Director of Climate Change, DGCC, MOEF, joining us. Thank you, Ibu Nia, for joining us.
Good morning, everyone.
She has a background in environmental, economic, and public policy, and she has very concrete and solid experience. She's been working with MOEF for 21 years now. And she has been involved with the establishment process of BPDLH, the new environmental fund, since 2015, I believe, since the beginning. So we will learn a lot from her insights about BPDLH and about mobilizing investments for sustainable landscape sectors in Indonesia. Secondly, I would like to welcome Lisa, the CEO of ADM Capital Foundation, joining us from Hong Kong. She's the founder and CEO of ADM Capital Foundation. Which is an innovative philanthropic vehicle to support critical research and impact-driven approaches to promoting environmental conservation in Asia. The foundation has widely been recognized for its work on solutions to some of the most intransigent challenges: our depleting oceans, the nexus between forestry and development, air quality and public health, as well as the intersections between food, energy, and water. In addition, Lisa also provides the ESG advisory services to the ADM Capital Funds, which is also based out of Hong Kong. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us. Welcome. Lisa, I believe you're on mute.
Thanks, Vikop.
Yeah, no worries. Then I would like to also introduce Robert Büermann from right now he's in Germany. He is the CEO of Fairventures Social Forestry. Before taking on the role of CEO of Fairventures Social Forestry, Robert was heading the business development at Fairventures worldwide. And then recently, a couple of years ago, transitioned into the role of CEO of Fairventures Social Forestry. Robert, connected to the Fairventures 1 million tree program since its inception, Robert has shaped Fairventures' path from non-profit projects towards a profitable business model with scalable and social and environmental impact. We really look forward to learning more about the Fairventures social forestry model. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Vikop. Welcome, everyone. Selamat sore.
Lastly, but not the least, Marcel, GGGI Indonesia country representative, globally recognized as the leading peatland and wetlands conservationist with impressive achievements under his belt. Marcel joined GGGI as the country representative in Indonesia in 2017. I would hand over very soon to Marcel to give us a little bit of a brief about GGGI and its work. Welcome, Marcel.
Thank you, Vikop, and hello, everybody.
Great. I think before we move ahead, a couple of housekeeping announcements so that everyone is on the same page and we are able to have this panel discussion in a very smooth manner. So we have slated around 2 hours for this panel discussion. However, we are expecting to run it for around 1.5 hours. The agenda is fairly straightforward. We will have a brief opening remarks as well as a short presentation from Marcel for around 10 to 15 minutes, after which we will straight away dive into a very interactive panel discussion. We will request all the participants, the attendees, to stay on mute during the panel discussion. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A section to type in your questions. After the panel discussion, we will take up the questions which have come from the attendees, as well as we will open up the floor for live questions to be taken from the attendees, during which the participants can ask specific panelists or everyone, I guess, on who is attending about the different aspects and issues that they would want to discuss. We are keeping the panel discussion very interactive, like I said. So there will be minimal presentations during this event. Maybe I set a little bit of backdrop for the conversation before I. Sorry, the last another thing is that if you are going to be asking questions during the live Q&A, please raise your hand, and the admins of on the panel discussion, they will call on you. So that's how we will keep the question and answer in a very orderly manner. So I'll hand it over to Marcel to maybe give a little bit of opening remarks, as well as maybe tell us a little bit more about GGGI and its investment work in Indonesia. Marcel, floor is yours.
Thank you, Fikop. So welcome everybody to this webinar. We're very happy to organize this for Indonesia. I think everybody recognizes that the forests, nature have much to contribute towards climate change mitigation and also to the adaptation aspects. But so far, only very limited finance is flowing in this direction. Very limited climate finance, about 3% or so. Whereas the estimates are that the landscapes can actually contribute about 30% to the solution. So there's a lot of work to be done, apparently, to attract more finance in this sector. There's very limited investments going on, or too limited, to really be able to give a tangible input into the climate solutions that we can derive from the landscapes. In Indonesia, I think this is even more important because in Indonesia, the emissions from landscapes are at the moment still the majority of emissions. They're larger than those of industry and waste and other sectors. So there's a great need in Indonesia to address these emissions. And also in the NDC, the nationally determined contribution from the country, the commitment to actually address Indonesia's carbon profile is particularly strong on the landscape side. But then if there's only very limited investments going into this area, of course it will be very difficult for Indonesia to achieve those commitments. So we need to look at what are the impediments to these investments. Why are these investments not coming? And what can we do about it? And I think that's what this session is about, this webinar. We hope that through the discussions, maybe we can give a little bit of clarifications of what the impediments are, what the problems are, but also particularly what are the solutions and how can each of us contribute with ideas and with action towards those solutions. So I think that's a bit of an introduction, but a little presentation has been prepared for this as well. So maybe we can go into that now, Fikop. And then I can give a little bit of information about GGGI as well. So GGGI is an international organization. We were
do you want to share your screen, Marcel? Sorry.
Am I sharing the presentation, or is that done by you?
I think you can do it.
Okay, then I'll move on.
So that we are sure that we have the latest version.
Let me then get into that. One moment.
Sure. I welcome all the attendees again. We have a strength of 45 attendees now.
So you're now seeing, I guess, the screen?
Yes, Marcel, we are able to see.
But I'm not on the first slide. So this is the first slide. So yeah, the whole session is about mobilizing green investment for the sustainable landscape sector. GGGI is an international organization. Our headquarters is in Seoul. We've been recently established, I think around 2012. And started operations in Indonesia in 2013. Our whole remit to exist is based on our membership from our countries. Indonesia is one of our founding members. We're very pleased with that, of course. And our Indonesia operations are also one of the largest operations of the organization in the world. So we are here to support our members, and this webinar is one of the activities that we undertake for that. At the moment, we have about 38 members, 37 members around the world. I think it's quite evenly spread over the whole world. We have 33 country offices. Our operations focus on providing assistance to the member countries, in particular developing countries and countries in transition. So if we go into looking at the forest landscape in Indonesia, we see that quite a substantial part is allocated for production, in the production forest and convertible production forests, but also quite a lot of the 120 million hectares that are at the moment in the forest landscape are considered to be protected as conservation forests or protection forests. So there are quite a few categories. If you look at a few of these, the conservation forests at the moment cover about 22 million hectares. But we also should recognize that a large part of these already have been affected by deforestation, often illegal activities. So about 21% of this forest was not forested in 2017. Similarly, with the protection forest, total of almost 30 million hectares, 20% was not forested in 2017. And then from the production forest, almost 70 million hectares, 42% was not forested in 2017. So that shows that a lot of the forest area in Indonesia is in need of rehabilitation and restoration, and that will require a lot of investment. And that means restoration means not only bringing it back to maybe fully natural habitat, but can also be bringing it back to productive habitat, but with a forested nature. So permanent kind of vegetation through perhaps agroforestry. Indonesia has a very special position, I think, in the world, being the country, the tropical country with the largest area of tropical peatlands. So about half of the world's tropical peatlands are located in Indonesia. Generally, these areas are forested, but have been a large part of these have been deforested over the last decades. Often as a result of unsustainable and often also unsuccessful development enterprises. All those degraded peatlands are considered to be a very low economic valuation, so they've been given actually quite limited priority in terms of development investments. But we look at the carbon profile of these peatlands. The degraded peatlands contribute a huge amount of Indonesia's emissions. Almost half of Indonesia's total emissions from all industry, transport, waste, and landscape are actually coming from Indonesia's peatland areas. Moreover, we look further than just the carbon profile in terms of the economics. peatlands are now contributing negatively to Indonesia's development, where with the frequent fire disasters and haze disasters, actually there's a lot of economic damage being caused. Of course, fires don't occur only in peatlands, also in other forest areas, but the peatlands do contribute disproportionately much of the haze and therefore much of the economic damage. So in 2015, the fires in Indonesia, particularly the peatland fires, contributed about 16 billion in economic losses in various sectors. So it contributed to losses in the tourism sector, in transport sector, many other important economic sectors were affected. And 2015 is known, of course, as one of the disaster years with a El Nino happening, so a very dry period. But last year, for instance, 2019, was not known as such a year, but still there were quite a lot of fires, and the forest and peatland fires contributed $5.2 billion in economic damages to various sectors in Indonesia. So the peatlands require our attention, not just to deal with their disproportionately large climate impact, but also their negative economic impact. Require us to look at these areas, and particularly for investments, to see if we can turn it around and turn us into a positive investment area. If you look at the total forest-based revenue in Indonesia, there are several sources in which Indonesia is actually making money out of forests, including payments by industry into the reforestation fund, forest resource royalties, business licenses for different kinds of concessions, environmental service utilization businesses, also from fines and from other compensation funds. But the total amount of income, for instance, in 2015, from these sources was just $300 million. So that's not a lot. And over a period of about 6 years, the total contribution to Indonesia's economy was only $1.7 billion. So maybe we have to review this and see, okay, this is the basis. There are other economic values linked to the whole forestry sector. And we all, I think, are aware of the fact that there are a lot of ecosystem services being derived from forests. And they actually have a very high value, but they're not being incorporated in the economy. They're not being incorporated into the planning. They're not being recognized as assets. And so when they're being lost, it's also not being recognized. And I think that has a big impact on the whole priority, or the lack of priority that are being given in investment portfolio, both from the public and the private sector. If we look at the emissions profile over the last almost 20 years, we see that the total emissions of Indonesia are about 1.5 gigaton, 1,500 million tons of carbon dioxide emission equivalents. And that there has been a steady increase in these emissions also between 2000 and 2016, even up to now. And the emissions from land use and land use change in forests are about 60%. So they cover the largest part of the emission profile. Indonesia has a very high commitment, a very ambitious nationally determined contribution, with 29% of emission reductions against the forward-looking baseline being projected as a commitment for unconditional emission reductions, meaning that this will be done on basis of financing by Indonesia itself. And there's a higher commitment in terms of up to 41% if we take into account all the potential international assistance that can come in, international collaboration for emission reductions in Indonesia. Again, the most significant reductions are planned in the forestry sector. If we look at the graph, you see that the emissions from, for instance, the energy sector, the blue bars below the orange and yellow, that's all energy, that will still go up in the projected carbon profile over the coming years, up to 2030. Whereas the dark blue of the forest emissions will actually go down and will be reduced to only about 8%. So it means that Indonesia's ambition, NDC ambition in the forest and land use sector, is to reduce over 90% of these emissions by 2030. So that's an extremely high ambition for the land use sector. Already quite a lot of policies have been put in place by Indonesia to achieve this. It includes one map policy, a moratorium on further licensing in primary natural forests, a review of licenses on peatlands, a high ambition for restoring degraded peatland ecosystems. And also Indonesia recognizes that communities can play a key role in forest management and forest restoration, and hence a target so far of 12.7 million hectares for social forestry aspects. Now GGGI is excited to be able to help our government partners with these achieving these high ambitions. So we're looking at a number of areas where we, with our forest and investment team, can provide assistance. Over the last years, we've been looking at the opportunities in social forestry development. We've been looking at the development of new commodity chains, particularly also for peatland areas where the traditional use of peatlands been focused on drainage-based peatland utilization, such as palm oil and pulp for paper. But if you really want to go for sustainable peatland management, you need to fully re-wet these areas. And so there's a need for different crops, which are called paludiculture crops. But this will require the development of new commodity chains. So we've been looking into that. And of course, we see that it's quite a steep hill to climb. But there are significant potential development opportunities there. We would like to see if we can get also private sector to contribute into this. And what are the basic modalities, the basic conditions to entice private sector to get into this? Then we've been looking at what will be required to actually upscale these kind of activities and take them to landscape-wide project scale and even subnational jurisdictional scales. So, and what kind of financing mechanisms would be required for that? So we've been looking into peat bond financing. We've been helping with the Indonesian government, particularly East Kalimantan, with establishing the first subnational emission reduction project, really looking at provincial-wide emission reduction planning. And attracting resource-based payments for that. Then, of course, there's the exciting development of the National Environment Fund, the BPDLH, and also the carbon marketing that can be part of that. Indonesia is looking at the development of a domestic carbon market, and we feel that there's a great opportunity there for various kinds of carbon-related projects and ecosystem restoration-related projects that can contribute to such a domestic carbon market. And even projects that have been catering traditionally for the voluntary international carbon market have indicated that there's a strong interest for them actually to start contributing to the jurisdictional programs in Indonesia, meaning that they could also work within this nationally oriented, the domestic carbon market. Then there is, of course, a active logging industry, a timber industry in Indonesia, who are interested in sustainable logging, in reduced carbon impact logging, so new models for utilizing this major resource base in Indonesia, and they can, I think, be stimulated and enticed to get further into but they need some assistance as well, maybe some de-risking money to help them with that kind of enterprise. And then there's a need also to look at the conservation areas and how we can strengthen the operation of conservation management in Indonesia, not just for carbon, but also I think there's a major resource there, for instance, for Indonesia's tourism sector. So these are some of the areas that we've been looking at with our government partners, and maybe some of the areas that we can explore also in the discussion that can follow now. So thank you very much for your attention, and let's start with the questions and the debate. Fikop, over to you.
I think it's not going to be a debate, Marcel, because everyone here agrees on the topic, which is everyone wants to mobilize the investments for sustainable landscapes. So I would say that probably not going to be a debate. But thank you so much for the presentation and to give us an overview. If you stop presenting, then we will just move forward.
Sorry, I
no worries.
didn't see that. No.
Yeah, and we will dive right into the panel discussion.
Okay, now I found the button. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No worries. Okay, so I think we dive right into it. I think during this, I will basically raise some questions and ask each panel member to share their views and share some information from their side. So let's get started. I think, like we saw, Bunia, I think we will start with you. Like we saw from Marcel's presentation as well, the ambition of government of Indonesia is really high with the NDCs, and it's really commendable. I think it's very much required and it's very much welcomed from that perspective. However, so I wanted to ask you if you can share with us about the government of Indonesia's plans and some policies to mobilize private or public sector finance and investment for the sustainable landscape sector in Indonesia.
Thank you, Fikop. Yes, I think Marcel already explained very clearly regarding the target of Indonesia NDC. It's quite ambitious, I think, and right now we're also in the process in updating our NDC. But I'm not sure that I think we don't want to increase the target. We still keep the target with the previous one. And regarding your question, what's the government Indonesia plans to mobilize private sector investment? Yes, I think talking about the private sector, I think private sector in Indonesia plays a key roles in sustainable landscape sector. But however, we don't have any data from of private sector share in climate change measure. But I think back to the government plans to mobilize private sector, one of the plans is giving recognition to private sector participation in climate change measure. And a government recognition over the issue is stated clearly in our NDC, which highlight that engagement of private sector will continuously be enhanced. And also the government highlight the existing best practices done by private sector to scale up the diversity of innovative climate change mitigation and adaptation effort. And we hope by giving the recognition to private sector, it is expected that it can stimulate more participation of private sector and of course finally can mobilize private sector investment. And beside that plans, we also have other plans to mobilize the private sector investment. Maybe the first one regarding the RED Plus. At this point, government already developed some regulation regarding the RED Plus, Permen LHK number 70. So in this case, we would like to give incentive to non-party stakeholder, including a private sector, either fiscal or non-fiscal. I mean, only for the RED Plus, maybe it related to non-fiscal incentive. So regarding the RED Plus, I think as we know, I mean, based on our data, the RED Plus is a key subsector or landscape sector giving significant contribution to the emission reduction in Indonesia. So at this point, the measure done by private sector should not only based on business as usual in RED Plus implementation. If they want to get a benefit from the RED Plus or incentive from the RED Plus program in Indonesia, but it should cover measure beyond that compliance. And then another plans, right now we are under process to develop carbon pricing regulation. It's an instrument to encourage the participation of private sector as well in climate change measure. So one of the mechanism of carbon pricing is carbon trading. So at this point, the government will develop a domestic carbon market, as Marcel already mentioned, but it doesn't mean we will close for the international market. But for the international market, I think we have to wait the negotiation under Article 6. And also under the regulation, we also regulate that for international transaction have to get authority from the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. And of course, the international trading should not reduce the NDC target. So I think it should be outside of the NDC target. Regarding the carbon pricing policy, I think we have conducted early public consultation in January 2020, involve all stakeholders, including private sector, academici, and also NGO and others. And then for further public consultation with all stakeholders, we will be held soon after Hari Raya Idul Fitri. So President asked Ministry of Environment or Forestry finish the regulation maybe soon, because right now there are a lot of practices underground in small scale regarding the carbon trading. I don't know. It could be classified as a RED Plus program or carbon trading. Let's discuss later on. And then regarding the fiscal incentive, I think the government, particularly Ministry of Finance, is still working on that issue. And then the tax on carbon will be one of a fiscal incentive form, will be put as one of a carbon pricing policy option. So I think that's government plans regarding how to mobilize the private sector investment in terms of climate change measure. Thank you, Vika.
Thank you, Bunia, for sharing. This is great. A lot of initiatives in the pipeline, and we look forward to seeing the drafts when they come out. I'll jump back to Marcel maybe. Marcel, what do you think are the key drivers to scale up sustainable landscape projects and practices and investment in Indonesia?
Thank you, Vika. I think first of all, it has to be profitable, to be able to be upscalable. So the key driver, the key incentive for people to make investments is to make money. And so I think one of the impediments that we see in this sector in Indonesia is that the regulatory frameworks at the moment often make it too difficult and too risky for entrepreneurs to step in. And therefore, there's very limited investment coming in. We have to recognize also there's a lot of risks at the moment in these landscapes. For instance, with the high risk of fires, the risk of illegal encroachments from people. I mean, Indonesia is not really well known for being able to address these issues rapidly and to have strong law enforcement in place. So entrepreneurs find it difficult under these circumstances, I think, to commit major resources. So profit is a key driver. Another key driver is of course the market. We see that in the palm oil sector, for instance, where I think there's been significant investments made by industry in improving sustainability, and it's particularly caused by market pressures where the customers, be it at the individual level, but also at national levels or even multinational level like the European Union, asking for higher levels of sustainability of this particular commodity. I think that's driving investment in sustainability, and RSPO is one of the frontrunners for that. But also Indonesia, you can see, is adopting certain sustainability measures through its Indonesia Sustainable Palm Oil legislation. So we see voluntary as well as legislative practices there. I think another major incentive for investing, but then particularly from the public sector, I think, in landscapes, are the huge costs of not making investments, of continuing the degradation. I showed that in my presentation where we're talking about tens of billions of dollars that are being lost, not just in the land use sector, but in many other economic sectors. They're being impacted by the forest fires, by the peatland haze. There's major public health impacts. So that is something that the government needs to address if it really wants the economy to continue. And the maintenance of positive ecosystem services coming from peatlands and from forests, I think should be recognized as a major driver and are increasingly recognized by the Indonesian government as such. So you can see that in the current 5-year plan of Indonesia, where low carbon development has been given quite a high recognition. And so you can see that there's been quite a major change in government planning in the direction almost of more sustainable planning. And I think that's something that I hope will also entice private sector to come in and to have trust that the government will provide support to their enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. Talking about the private sector, maybe I go to Lisa first. Lisa, same question. What are the key drivers from your perspective to scale up sustainable landscape investments in Indonesia?
In terms of scaling, I mean, I guess I should speak about our own experiences to start with. So I set up a foundation in 2006 for the partners of ADM Capital, which is an investment manager, obviously based in Hong Kong. And what we saw, we were interested in the whole issue of deforestation and land use, given that, you know, as we've heard from Marcel, 37% of GHG emissions from the sector come from the sector, and we were focused on Indonesia with the third or fourth largest forest globally. That was sort of a target for us, and where land use is of course responsible for up to 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we were focused on the land use sector and how to address these challenges that we saw, but also recognizing that the rural sector in Indonesia is critical in terms of jobs, of course. So you can't really talk about conservation without talking about jobs. So despite the complexities, the land use sector, I think, receives only about 3% of global climate flows. So delivery of the Paris Climate Agreement, SDGs, will be challenging unless investment in that sector is rapidly scaled up. So our focus was on how do you provide finance in this space, and how do you scale it up? So we started working in 2008 in Northern Sulawesi, providing support to a good conservation project. But again, the challenge there was, how do you wrap the community into a conservation agenda? You can't just talk about conservation, you must talk about community, and there must be benefit to the community from these sort of conservation areas. If you do want to talk about additional investment in the land use sector, and you do want to talk, and you need to talk about scale, right? So you can't, we saw clearly that you just cannot have conservation without social license. Same as a company operating, you need that social license to operate in order to perform well, and people need jobs and an ability to to feed their families. And so ring fencing forest areas without providing the alternatives is not a sustainable opportunity. It's not a sustainable option if forest protection is the agenda. So we started looking at, what would be the options to fund the type of development work that was needed in order to provide the livelihoods and protect the forests from encroachment, the encroachment that Marcel describes that is challenging in an Indonesia context. And how do you give communities alternatives and in effect place a value on the protection of that forest for them? And that obviously involves significant capital. This is expensive work. And you want to create these investment opportunities in order to drive the private sector capital. Private sector is a broad term, but maybe we could talk about the investment opportunities that exist in this context. And how do you shape these projects that are bankable, that are investable opportunities at scale? So we, what's needed is, in terms of building livelihoods, of course, is access to credit, the agricultural extension services, training and finance, better inputs, planting and materials, technology for traceability, all of these pieces of the puzzle that have been alluded to already, and that Indonesia is obviously thinking about in various contexts, but not always. There isn't a solution at scale to allow the type of opportunities that we would like to see. And as also has been alluded to, of course, transactions in the rural sector are considered risky because of the challenges of working with communities adjacent to these conservation projects, because of the encroachment challenges, because they do need livelihoods, and because there needs to be an investable, secure, bankable, project. And that isn't always the case. So, providing, as I was saying, the training and the agricultural extension services and the better inputs and planting and allowing livelihoods to develop, to flourish alongside these investment opportunities is absolutely is critical. And I completely agree with Marcel. Our view is the risk, though, of inaction is much greater than the risk of action, even though there is a lot of complexity in these landscapes. So what we've looked at, in effect, is trying to redefine risk in these sorts of transactions, reshaping them to include people in conservation as part of the equation, feeling that this is the way that one must invest in. That investment must happen looking forward in Indonesia. You can't invest differently, we believe, and it is about building the sort of partnerships to be able to provide the sort of complete transaction that we described above. So we created in 2016 something called the Tropical Landscapes Finance Facility for Indonesia with ADM Capital Foundation, BNP Paribas, UN Environment, and ICRAF. And the idea was to provide access to long-term capital in Indonesia for projects that responded to Indonesia's climate and poverty alleviation objectives, their NDCs. And we wanted to invest in two areas: sustainable agriculture and renewables. And we've built a sort of a pipeline of opportunities that are at scale and that do respond in a sort of complete way, I think, to these complex landscapes. So it is partnerships, and it is a complex sort of arrangement of opportunities, I think, that we see in these projects. But we do see the opportunities to build these projects and to redefine how we are working, how private sector is engaging in Indonesia. And as has been said, sort of the market pressure is a critical piece of this puzzle. And also, obviously, Indonesia's commitment to sustainability has been a big sort of support to the project. The legality questions around land tenure and then the need for training, these are questions that need to be answered. But we do believe that that we can work at scale in a complex landscape like we've seen in Indonesia.
Thank you, Lisa. I completely agree with that. The community inclusiveness is a key element to taking these projects and the impact itself at scale. I think talking about communities, probably it's a good time to talk to Robert. Robert, why don't you explain a bit more about the work of Fairventures Social Forestry and the market size that the company is going after, the model itself, and tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, thank you, Rikalp. I agree very much with what has been said by Marcel and Lisa. So what we really need to bring sustainable landscape projects to scale is to link them to income generation and markets. And that's actually what we're trying to do at Fairventures Social Forestry. So we are working currently in with a focus on on the social forestry program of the Indonesian government to work with communities and generate these income generating opportunities for the communities by working with an agroforestry approach on degraded areas of these social forestry permits. So our theory of change is we need to bring people into income generating activities on degraded areas, and unfortunately we have more than enough of those in Indonesia. And by doing that, we can also manage to conserve the still existing forest areas. So if we can take the economic pressure of the forests by working on degraded areas with the plantation approach, this can really solve the problem. That's what we're currently working on. We started in early 2019 to work with a social forestry permit and the communities related to that in central Kalimantan. It's a 3,000 hectare permit. And we are building a showcase of our sustainable business model on these 3,000 hectares. To show that this really works, that we actually can create livelihoods for people, take the pressure off the existing still intact forest areas, and also create a fair return for investors. So we really have a model that then can attract more investor money and actually has a chance to go to scale and solve the problem on a large scale. So building that in a showcase setup right now for the next couple of years on 3,000 hectares. Our ambition is to manage about 100,000 hectares in 10 years from now. So we really try to build the showcase to unlock the capital in the markets to go to scale. So maybe talking about the market size that you've been asking for. So we are working with an agroforestry approach. So our main market is lightwood timber, actually. So we are not trying to get back like an original natural forest, but we are using degraded areas for a plantation approach with lightwood timber that actually has a pretty big market. So when you look at Indonesian timber exports in 2019, that whole market had a value of about $12 billion US. Our research and assumptions are pointing at about 40 to 50% of that being lightwood. So we are looking at a huge market, and this was actually also how we even started up in the NGO about 5-6 years ago in central Kalimantan, by looking at the markets and looking at what we need to produce together with the communities that can be sold into existing markets, and people can actually create a livelihood from that. So that's the main part, producing lightwood timber, but we're not only looking at timber, we're also looking at more value-added products from lightwood timber. So in the combination of Fairventures as an NGO and Fairventures Social Forestry as an implementing social venture, we have that nice combination that we are also looking into how can we develop that industry in the future? How can we make the timber sector in Indonesia a more progressive sector with more value-added products? And we are working with partners in the industry, but also with leading universities on a couple of projects to progress into higher margin products. And maybe I can show you just quickly 2 examples of that. So do you see my screen already?
Yeah.
Okay, so what you see on the lower part of that picture that I hopefully can enlarge. Yeah, so on the lower part of the picture, you see glue laminated beam construction that we did for the Trade Expo in Jakarta in 2017. And on the lower left side, if you have good eyes, you see President Jokowi at our stand as well. So this is a innovative way of using lightwood timber in construction. And a nice example of that you see on the upper part of the picture, which is a football stadium, which is fully constructed with that laminated beam technology. It's just being constructed in Austria. And there are a lot of more very progressive projects of that kind also in the Philippines, where they're planning a 30-story full wooden house with that technology. So this is something we are trying to promote and also to introduce midterm in the Indonesian timber industry to get into more value creation in the sector. And a second example that I would like to share with you is we're working on that now with a technical university in Germany and some engineers. This is a low-cost housing solution, which is completely constructed out of already existing lightwood timber products. These houses are in a module construction, and a bit like an IKEA style. So what you see on the lower part is that all the different parts that you need for building that house are predefined. You can easily put them and ship them with a container on site and then just stack them together like you stack together your IKEA furniture. And you have sustainable housing for tropical areas at a low cost. We are working on that now, and if the Corona situation allows us, we're going to construct the first test facilities later this year in central Kalimantan. So these are just 2 examples we're working on, where we not only try to produce timber with the communities, but we also try to get into a higher value creation in the sector. So this is the market, one of the key markets we're focusing on. Then, of course, we also look into the cash crops in our agroforestry approach. We're still in a test phase with what works best in our setup. Plan is to come up with 2 to 3 cash crops where we can really go down the value chain and also get into products and markets that go beyond the commodity.
Great.
So maybe that gives a bit of a picture. Then one other source of income we're looking into is, of course, an income from CO2 markets. But frankly speaking, this is still a bit of a challenge for us.
Okay. No, this is great. Thanks for sharing, Robert. Let me follow up by asking, you mentioned creating a fair return for the investors and go to scale. From your experience since now, like, what are the kind of returns that you are seeing? And secondly, do you think there will be a trade-off between scale and returns as you grow?
So yeah, thanks for the question. With our model, we're right now targeting returns for investors of 10%, so a 10% IRR based on the 25-year model. We're this is a base case scenario, so we're working on all levels right now to prove and to improve that. So there's additional potential, as I briefly mentioned, for example, from CO2 that we could tap into. Additional potential from these value-added products that I mentioned with a midterm perspective. So but a 10% IRR should be doable. That's what we're trying to prove right now. Having said that, it's a model for patient investors. It's a 25-year model, and we're talking timber. So even though we are working with fast-growing timber species and rotational periods of 7 years, it takes us 8 years to become cash flow positive. So this is nothing for investors that are looking for the quick money.
Okay.
You were asking for a trade-off between scaling and returns. I think it's not so much a trade-off between scaling and returns. What we really need for scaling is we need to build a successful showcase right now, and this is actually where we are looking for support from government or government institutions, from very specific investors that are prepared to take some risks that we're trying to take out now while we're building this showcase to prove that this really works. But in the beginning, as many of you know, when you're trying to build this, there are still risks involved, and you still need to build the proof of the pudding. So we're now looking for capital that is a bit more risk-taking than commercial investors would be doing.
Sure. Lisa, similar question to you about the commercial attractiveness of investments in sustainable landscape sector and how the experience has been when it comes to different kind of scale within the projects. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I mean, again, I guess I refer back to our first transaction in the sector, which was a $95 million sustainability bond for a natural rubber plantation on degraded land in 2 provinces in Indonesia, Jambi and East Kalimantan. It was the use of proceeds was to build the rubber plantation for a JV between Michelin and Barito Pacific. 49-51% sort of ownership structure between the two. Our interest in the project was that it was adjacent to the Bukit Tigapulu National Park, so it provides that, everyone talks about a functional buffer zone from a commercial plantation to help protect a national park, and this helps protect the southern border of the national park. Of course, there is an MOU between the company Royal Lestari Utama and the national park. And there's been a lot of very strong sort of government of Indonesia support for the project at a national level and also at a local level, which has really been very important in terms of the development of this particular initiative by Royal Lestari Utama. In terms of sort of what made the successful the bond issuance to provide the funding for the natural rubber plantations, which will be 34,000 hectares of 90,000 hectares. They've planted 20,000 hectares so far. The rest set aside for conservation and community partnerships. So I've described the sort of partnership model that needs to happen in terms of communities and conservation, finance, and the commercial aspects of a project. And this sort of does illustrate quite well, I think, how a project like this can be pulled together at scale. That conservation area, of course, allows for the sort of unfettered flow of, well, supposedly, if one hopes animals stay to that sort of 9,700 hectare zone, but it's to allow the flow of animals through sort of a part of the concession. The no-go zones, no-go zones were set aside in partnership with an environmental group that was involved in the early days of the development of this project, and that was all based on sort of HCV, HCS assessments The company's already working with about 800 farmers, buying rubber, providing training and other livelihood support in that project. That component, that community partnership program, will be ramped up quite significantly. They have, there are about 50,000 people living in and around the landscape, at 10,000 families, so 50,000 people, if you can consider 5 people per family. And the project will also include 16,000 jobs for people at maturity in the 2 different landscapes. So far, about 4,500 people have been employed. As I say, they have 20,000 hectares planted so far. And there are 23 communities sort of living in and around the concessions, and all of the engagement has sort of gone on with all of those communities, and there are sort of very strong sort of grievance, there's quite strong grievance support within those communities too, and a sort of a system of complaint, which is quite important. What made this transaction possible in this context, in this rather challenging context, obviously was the sort of the blended finance components. So USAID provided a partial guarantee to the loan, and that was that made it possible. That we received grants for carbon components, and P4F supported the development of the wildlife conservation area and is looking at supporting the community partnership components of this. And of course, TLFF has supported sort of broadly across the entire project. We're seeing not dissimilar types of projects that can be assembled in commodities, but what I would say also is important in this particular project is the step up from Michelin, the MNC that really has taken that equity position in a project like this, but not only spoken about the importance of sustainability, but actually stepped in with significant capital to secure its interests in this project. And at maturity, this project will represent 10% of Michelin's global natural rubber, and they have made commitments to, I think, be 80% content, sustainable natural content. I think some date in the future, but they have made commitments, but they've also stepped in with their finance to support a project practically. And that has been really terrific to see, and it would be great to see other MNCs step in the same way beside Indonesian companies to help them to improve yields. I mean, the yield of an average sort of smallholder, 90% of rubber in all globally is produced by smallholders, and palm oil, I think it's 40%. So the smallholders are an important component of any commodity, but yields are low, as we know. So in terms of rubber, I think it's about 800 kilograms per hectare production is the sort of normal smallholder production. Michelin can double that with better planting materials and better practices. So having a company again step in and improve yields and livelihoods for smallholders is an important component of this project and any project, I would say. That's what we want to see as intensification on existing land, so that you can then protect the conservation areas. So so we can see that with other MNCs stepping up the way Michelin has, by others stepping into to act as not even necessarily as equity component of a project, but also as off-takers, providing guarantees, price commitments to smallholders for sustainable product. That's another one, offering a better price for a sustainable product that goes not just to the trader, but actually to the farmer. That's really going to be important, looking forward to incentivize better practices. Using their balance sheet for loans to smallholders, first loss pieces. Also, there are many approaches that could be taken involving the MNCs, as well as guarantee sources of guarantees like USAID or Garantco or others who do offer guarantees in this type of project. So another opportunity that we're looking at, and Vikalp, you know this well, is we're looking at a climate bond. So how do you generate finance for projects where there is no revenue, but you need, you want to incentivize the emissions reduction and help Indonesia comply with its NDC, right? Land restoration, regeneration of peat lands, protection of forests, farming on community lands with non-damaging crops. So looking at how you provide a source of finance in that sort of context at scale.
Yep. Okay, thank you for sharing. I guess my main thing is that the blended finance really pushed up the commercial attractiveness in the rubber project, and going forward, I guess similar mechanisms would have to be designed and developed in order to make sure that the investments and the projects themselves are commercially attractive. Let me go back to Bunia a little bit. Bunia, can you share a little bit with us about how you see the investment potential for different permit areas and licenses, like whether it is an ecosystem restoration concession, whether it is PANRAP, the carbon sequestration and storage permits, social forestry licenses like what Robert mentioned earlier, or otherwise peatland areas, which Marcel also has mentioned. If you have any perspective on how to mobilize investments in these concession areas.
Thank you, Fikap. Yes, I think before I go for each concession area, I think I agree with Lisa. I think blended finance is needed in climate change measure. I think all the program run by government and also by private sector should be aimed to community surrounding the forest area. So the ultimate goal is how we can increase the community's welfare. So also I think it will be explained in each concession or permission regarding the first one, maybe regarding ecosystem restoration concession. As we know that Indonesia already issued government regulation number 6 year 27. So it's kind of how ecosystem restoration have been developed as a new market-oriented governmental instrument to address current deforestation processes and to restore forest ecosystem. So I think referring to this regulation, government already highly highly a promising instrument in Indonesia, and I think in other countries as well. And I think in this area also it is very clear that government gives opportunity to private sector to restore certain ecosystem designated by government. And of course, when the private sector running the program, I mean, they have to also include how they can increase the community welfare surrounding the forest area, as I mentioned before. So I think referring to the regulation, private sector also have opportunity to utilize the carbon benefit as well. However, I think policy support is still needed for ecosystem restoration concession to ensure their economic viability. Since, as we know, maybe like for carbon or non-carbon benefit are still up and down in the market, particularly for this condition caused by COVID-19, and maybe it will have a long-term impact. So I think it is important to further assess the economic feasibility of ecosystem restoration concession. So I think at this point, this policy will have has linkage with the carbon pricing policy later on. And then regarding the carbon sequestration, I think it still has linkage with ecosystem restoration concession. As I mentioned earlier, that private sector also have can have another benefit beside the how they can restore the ecosystem. They also have carbon benefit. Before, I mean, a private sector can utilize the carbon benefit while waiting the ecosystem reach the balance condition. So there are some requirements that should be fulfilled, of course, by private sector to participate in carbon sequestration project, such as how to revise the business work plan. And again, it's also I think still have linkage with the policy that we are developed right now regarding the carbon pricing. And also maybe regarding the social forestry licenses, I think Robert already mentioned a lot of how the drive and also the process of development of social forestry program in Indonesia. I think there are two big components as follow regarding the social forestry. The first one is permitting licenses. So the permitting licenses is the process to design the social forest area and to prepare all the instrument. And this area is government responsibility, I think. And then how the private sector can involve in the social forestry licenses. I think after licensing issued by government, the private sector can involve at this point. Pak Robert also already mentioned a lot regarding this matter. I think the development of social forestry business is next step after the issuance of a permit, which emphasize the community-based forest management program. So the community can have alternative income from non-timber forest product, and also again from carbon benefit as well. I think even it still need to have more discussion in this matter, particularly maybe it will be included as well in our policy on carbon pricing. So I think in this area, private sector have opportunity to be off-taker or buyer on non-timber forest product, and also carbon benefit produced by a group community. And then regarding the peatland, I think as we know that peatland play a significant role in carbon storage and sequestration. And then in Indonesia itself, peatland is home for 20 million hectare, or 50% of tropical peatlands that has a significant role in maintaining the biodiversity. And of course, also, as I mentioned, regarding the carbon storage as well. So I think, as we know, Indonesia already issued a permit as well in peatland area. And also Indonesia has established Indonesia Peatland Restoration Agency, which has been tasked with restore 2 million hectares of damaged peatland in Indonesia by the end of 2020. So I think in this area, the private sector has opportunity to involve in the program restoration. As I mentioned that government already issued some permit in peatland, but I think government also has issued some government policy for private sector that mentioned that the private sector that already have a permit in peatland area should revise the business work plan by giving more focus on forest protection to minimize the forest fire and also its risk, as well as preventive measure of forest fire. So I think at the end, I think a lot of opportunity how private sector can invest in each area of concession or permit. I think with of course the ultimate goal of the community welfare. I think that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, I really agree with you even here about the private sector and the government program working together, and you laid it out quite clearly with the social forestry example that the permit is government's responsibility, but post permit it's private sector should come in. Maybe I go quickly back to Robert, but before that, let me say I'm also keeping an eye on the time. I think we have 15 more minutes for the discussion, and after that we will switch over to a Q&A with the attendees. Okay, so going back to Robert, I think, Robert, from your experience with the social forestry, operationalizing and working with the communities about the social forestry, what are the challenges that you see with these kind of public-private arrangements and collaborations? What are the key challenges, maybe like top two challenges that you see?
Well, thanks, Vikal, for that question. Yeah, we're actually facing quite a bit of challenges in implementing these programs. Well, key challenges they're focusing only on two is already a challenge in itself. I would say the working in setups that have clear land title is one of the key challenges when you talk about scaling. So the social forestry program is one option for that. The option we chose right now to provide a first showcase. Frankly speaking, we're seeing actually a bit of reluctancy from from investors when it comes to government programs. So we are also looking into alternatives, how we can scale besides the forestry program. But key is always getting access to areas with a clear land title. So with our partner Borneo Initiative, we are looking into opportunities working with large timber concessions on their degraded areas. That's one example and one potential way to go. And we are experiencing a lot more interest from potential investors that would be prepared to step in once we go that step and work more in a private sector setup than only being dependent on a government program. That's one key issue with land titles and access to finance in that combination. So what would help, for example, from the government side is also a certain permit for sustainable landscape management for setups like ours, where we could get a direct access to specific permits for that, where we can manage these areas directly. Implementing within the social forestry program is certainly a way of doing that, but it is a lengthy process. And as Lisa already pointed out, it's quite a challenge to include all the interests of the community. It's a lot of going back and forth. The literacy level of people is also something that is slowing us down a lot, and where we could actually do with a good support from the government side in financial literacy programs, in training programs. As for a small organization like us, it's very difficult to do all these things on our own. So we are really looking for these partnerships with the government institutions to get support on these areas.
Okay, understood. So it's also related to the capacity on the ground. It's in addition to the institutions. Marcel, before I come to you, I'll quickly go to Lisa again to ask, maybe in the investment pipeline that TLFF and ADM Foundation is seeing, what are the top two main challenges and barriers coming through?
Yeah, I fear I may be repeating myself, but the higher perceived risk, the transactions involving smallholders with no formal credit history, land title, long project development lead times, exposure to poor quality collateral, exposure to weather, significant periods with no or low cash flows. These are new business models, as we've all discussed. The potential transactions can combine multiple revenue streams, and often there are no precedents or history of specific partners working together. So pulling together, again, that sort of partnership model. And technological innovation. There are lots of new ideas around regenerative agricultural, alternative proteins, and traceability technology, fintech, which is all important for the sector, but it's still untested and embryonic in most jurisdictions. Sovereign credit risk, familiar legal systems when we're talking about foreign investors, political stability, concerns about political stability, a lack of local currency hedging, the expense of that when you're talking about US dollars to IDR, withholding tax, that's a big issue also. When you have an impact situation, the development banks all have sort of a withholding tax holiday, but those of us who don't have that opportunity, that's an extra burden. And challenges with distance, of course, Indonesia being as huge as it is, and 17,000 islands. And then, of course, the long tenor financing requirements, because we're talking a lot about working in the land use sector. So that's, that the value is in, as Robert has discussed, 20, 25 years often. I mean, even if we're looking at most of the opportunities we're looking at are at least sort of 10 years. So finding that patient capital that's willing to support in this context. So again, we're looking at, we are looking at some quite interesting solutions, I think, to bring bankability to these types of projects. And even when, as I said, even when there is no sort of revenue source, I mean, how do you fund? We've talked a lot today about the importance of funding peatland restoration and forest protection and regeneration of lands, degraded lands. But where are the sources of finance that can repay if you're looking at that as an investment opportunity? So TLFF, one of our opportunities is to look at something that we call the climate fund. And, you know, at the same time, of course, you have this huge emissions reduction potential. If you can stem the burn every year and the encroachment and the deforestation. So the climate fund's looking at how we would finance a structure, how we would create a finance structure to support projects where there is no source of repayment. And we're looking at, you know, global models for this. IFM bond is one that we've looked at, which is a bond. Several of these have been issued, and they're not actually talked about very much. And I think it's quite an interesting structure, but it's a bond issued against sovereign commitments for vaccinations in Africa. So 5 countries came together and said, this is what we're going to commit to vaccinations in Africa over the next 20 years, but let's, you know, have the idea is to issue a bond against it, so you upfront that money. So you're not dribbling in money for vaccinations over 20 years, you're actually upfronting that money and vaccinating kids now. Well, the same applies to, you know, restoration projects or conservation projects. You need that money upfronted now to stem the emissions in a country like Indonesia. So you could do, we believe the same, you could do the same for climate in Indonesia, issue a bond against sovereign climate commitments to Indonesia. Either a government of Indonesia issued bond with or with something as an SPV with some sort of guarantee or support letter potentially provided by BPDLH to an SPV that issues the bond. And then project funds would be aggregated, of course, and distributed into projects that would also develop or evolve some sort of carbon benefit over time. And there would be sort of a carbon discipline around these. And of course, there's no carbon market yet in Indonesia to rely on carbon repayments. But in the future, that could be a source of repayment for this bond, with initial repayments being just from those sovereign commitments to Indonesia for performance in terms of protection and regeneration. So all I'm saying is there are quite a lot of interesting sort of financing structures out there that could be applied in a context that is challenging to incentivize the market, the ecosystem, you know, for ecosystem restoration concessions, or to incentivize sort of a marketplace around ecosystem benefit or carbon benefit that doesn't currently exist. So we need to look internationally, be creative, and try and mitigate some of these risks that we see. But in the end, as I said, and Marcel has said, the risk of inaction is much greater than the risk of action. The opportunity is there. It's just a matter of pulling together the different pieces that work within an Indonesian context. And as has been so clearly said, and I think we all feel very strongly, that these opportunities must benefit the communities, that otherwise they don't work. So they are about benefiting communities and post-COVID job opportunities in the rural sector also. You know, and maintaining jobs in the rural context. So,
yeah, great. I think talking about the financial structures and the role of BPDLH, the environmental fund, maybe Marcel, I come back to you and ask you, from your perception, from GGGI's perception, what do you think would be the role, or should be the role, of the new environmental fund in order to mobilize finance and investments in the sustainable landscape sector in Indonesia? Marcel, you're on mute.
Thank you, Vikap. Yeah, before going into BPDLH, I just want to reiterate that indeed it's a lot of what Lisa and Robert have been mentioning. These are the key items that need to be supported, actually be put in place by government. There's a lot of enabling that the government can do. What we now see is that there's an unequal playing field for sustainable oriented entrepreneurs and non-sustainable oriented entrepreneurs. And I think the government needs at least to create a level playing field for these. And that requires transparency. So we can start talking about a role for BPDLH, but if there's no transparency in the forestry sector, if there's no law enforcement in the forestry and land use sector, then I think it will be very difficult still to get investors to come in at large scale. So there's a real need for government to step up its role in these areas. I think a lot of what Robert is demanding in terms of landscape licenses, I think that's been partly already being addressed by the government, such as through the issuing of multiple use licenses now. If you work in a landscape, you can't just focus on one commodity. You need to have forestry, tourism, agriculture. You need to have that combined. Ecosystem restoration needs to be part of it. So what can a BPRH do? It's been mentioned a lot. I think BPRH could provide de-risking funding, so sharing of risks. If an entrepreneur comes in and you know that they can only start making profits in 8 to 10 years from now, because they have to have that long term of investment first, then a government needs to provide certain incentives for the years in between to at least guarantee some income for those entrepreneurs. That's not just for companies, but it's particularly also for smallholders and for communities. Transparency, I think, is also an issue for local communities, where, again, mentioned a lot, where they need to have clarity on tenure. If you don't have clarity on tenure and nobody wants to invest, and then a BPRH also cannot invest and cannot develop risk sharing mechanisms. So it all has to start with this legal clarity of land, legal clarity of licenses. How do you get a license? Can you get a license without corruption in less than a year? We know from certain ecosystem restoration license entrepreneurs, it took them over 5 years to get a license without corruption. So that's a huge amount of time and upfront funding that is required by the government without having a guarantee for success and working in a high risk environment. So the government needs to recognize these risks and needs to step in and create that transparency, create the legal clarity, then entrepreneurs can come in. Often it's being said, well, there's no pipeline for landscape investment. Well, there's no pipeline because there's no clarity on these issues. And then people just don't develop projects. So I think a BPRH can assist, I think, also by making these conditions for investments more clear. So I don't see BPRH only as a arranger of finance mechanisms, but they must also communicate, I think, to the different government departments what kind of investment conditions will be required also for BPRH to be willing to share risks in certain investments in the areas. And then, of course, the carbon market, I think, can be a great incentive. Indonesia has this commitment. 60% of the emission reductions need to come from the land use sector. This needs to be a domestic carbon market. We know that if you invest in energy, in waste, in industry, per ton of carbon emission reductions, you're talking about tens or hundreds of dollars per reduced a ton of carbon dioxide. In the land use sector, we're talking often about $5 per ton or even less. So actually, investing in the landscape sector is very interesting, should be very interesting for the government. If you link the carbon market from the energy sector and industry sector to the land use sector, you actually could create a lot of investment potential, also from the government, derived from maybe capped markets, where industry that is working above the cap can provide payments to a BPRH, and these payments can create a revenue that the government can use to incentivize and de-risk landscape-wide investments. So I think the domestic carbon market provides this opportunity, both for creating revenue for the government, but then also for creating investment. And we know there's already a lot of interest internationally for results-based payments. There's also a growing interest from carbon investors internationally, but at the moment they can't enter, they can't penetrate the Indonesian market because the carbon market is not there, but also because they don't get licenses. The licenses go to domestic industry. Then if you, as an international investor, want to go into the national like ecosystem restoration concession market, you need to pay upfront millions of dollars for your licenses. You need to have a trusted local company that you can work with, over which you have no power because you have less than 50% of shares in it. So you're taking huge risks upfront for something that may at some stage pay back, but for which no market has been created yet by the government. So there's all these enabling conditions that still need to be created before BPDLH can actually become active and become a real incentive mechanism. I think the BPDLH, yeah, it needs to, therefore, it needs to have as a priority to establish this local carbon market, but it needs to be a multi-sector local carbon market. It needs to identify how results-based payments that can come in already now from the kind of voluntary public sector, how they can be strategically used to generate possibilities for private sector investment in the landscape. They need to see how they can make use of upfront funding, such as bond financing, for de-risking, helping to de-risk private sector investment in the landscape, and how to scale up successful business models. And I think the BPDLH can provide, help to provide reliability in the sector by also demanding safeguards and transparency. I think there's a lot of big industry in Indonesia, also in the palm oil sector, in the pulp paper sector, that actually want to play a key role in this, also in the timber sector. But they need to incentivize by the government. They need some support from the government for themselves to play a role. Like in the HTI sector, there's now the possibility for multiple use licenses. I think in the palm oil sector, that's not possible yet. But the RSPO is demanding from its members to have set aside areas. All high conservation value areas, all high carbon areas need to be protected. Okay, what is the incentive that the government can provide to such RSPO members to actually play that active role in safeguarding these areas, and then also incentivizing and incorporating smallholders and local communities in those enterprises? That creates a lot of, or that requires a lot of work, a lot of risk taking by these entrepreneurs. Somehow that needs to be recognized by the government. Lisa mentioned the need for tax holidays. I think if the government sees that investors are coming in with large-scale, landscape-wide oriented investment that create green jobs for communities, why would you want to tax such entrepreneurs up front? Why would you want to ask high license fees from such entrepreneurs? Actually, you should be incentivizing them through by becoming a co-investor as government in such enterprises. Yeah. So I think the BPDLH can play a role in all these aspects. Thank you.
Yeah, I note your response, Marcel. I think it's very interesting what you said, that BPDLH probably, so from that perspective, it is not only an investment vehicle, it's also enabling vehicle, government, because it's a semi-government or government-owned body itself. So it should be playing a role in enabling the conditions for investment. Now, I guess I will go back to Bunia as the last commentary, I guess, on BPDLH, because she has been involved with the setup of BPDLH since 2015. Bunia, you've heard about the projects which are happening and private investors who are looking at Indonesia market as a really good potential market, as well as requirement of enabling conditions. Some final comments from your side on how BPDLH strategy is being formed, and what do you think should be the role of BPDLH when it comes to mobilizing investment?
Thank you, Vitkap, and also thank you, Marcel, for a lot of input for the BPDLH role in the future, I think. Yes, I think I do fully agree with the Marcel, what the BPDLH expected in the future. I think BPDL also have to role in the risking of the all environmental program at this point. Regarding the BPDLH role, I think a lot of things already mentioned by Marcel, but at this point, we would like to highlight that BPDLH can be a national financial mechanism complementing the regular mechanism through the state budget. So at this point, as we know that state budget right now is only intended for the government, the local government, and therefore we expect that by establishing the BPDLH, we would like to speed up the implementation of climate change measure in local level, because the BPDLH can deliver the money into beneficiaries in local level. And also regarding the enabling environment that should be developed before BPDLH operationalized, I think I also agree that right now one of the refer to our regulation that under the BPDLH will be steering committee consisting of a member minister of line minister from Bappenas, KLHK, Dagri, KKP. I forgot a lot, around 11 ministers. So the minister will have will give the BPDLH a kind of high-level policy strategic. So it will be breakdown into the pipeline that can be guidance for the BPDLH, how BPDLH can have a partnership with inter alia with the private sector as well, I think. And then how BPDLH can have a matchmaking project with the donor and other sources, of course, at this point. So I think that's all for the closing. So and also the last one in regarding the carbon market, how the role of the BPDLH carbon market. For me, it is too early to talk about the role of BPDLH, because in our regulation, even in our Perpres regarding the environmental fund management, is already stated that one of the role of BPDLH, so BPDLH can also deliver the money using the carbon trading mechanism. But in our carbon policy regulation, it's still, I mean, the regulation, the provision is still in general way, because it will be followed by detailed regulation in each minister, line minister. So I think, but I think we can consider maybe can include the BPDLH role in our policy. So it can be concrete how BPDLH can manage the money generated from the carbon pricing or carbon trading particularly. And also I would like to highlight maybe the generation from carbon trading, not only intended for the mitigation in the future, but also based on the share of proceeds from carbon pricing will be intended for the adaptation measure in Indonesia as well, I think. I think that's all. And can I have a last statement as well regarding the bonds, following the Lisa statement? Indonesia, I think we also have discussed with, I think, 3GI as well regarding how we in the process to assess the green bond, the possibility, the issuance of a green bond by government of Indonesia, and also we also collaborate with the TNC, I think. But based on our discussion with Ministry of Finance, that, and also with the Bappenas, I think it is a good opportunity for government to issue a green bond, particularly for the sustainable land-based bond. But the thing that we have to ensure that we have to consider there is, as we know that because sustainable land-based sector has a high uncertainty. So how we can reduce the risk, how we can manage the risk at these points. So maybe in the future, of course, Indonesia will open for all the financial instrument and also financial mechanism to speed up our in reaching our NDC target. I think that's all. Thank you.
Bunia. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, I think we will move on to the Q&A session. We just have 20 minutes left. So what I'll do is I'm looking at the questions which have already been posted by the attendees. There are a couple of questions, Bunia, related to the timeline of carbon policies coming out, carbon pricing policies coming out, and also the possibility of carbon coming from licenses like HTI or HPH, as well as from social forestry licenses. So there is, if there is any indication whether those conditions, those areas can also trade and have the carbon revenue. If you have any guidance around that, if you can share that.
Yeah, thank you, Vitkap. Yes, the timeline or the deadline of we have to finish the carbon pricing policy. Pak Luhut Panjaitan, the Ministry of Coordinator for Maritime and Investment, give us, to the Ministry of Environment and Forestry to finish it until 1 month after Hari Raya Idul Fitri. So maybe after we hold a public consultation twice, and then we will submit the regulation to the SETCAP, and then maybe it will take around 1 month. So right now, starting from now, it will take around 2 months to finish all the regulation, hopefully. And because after we submit to the SETCAP, it is out of our control. And then the second, I think, regarding the second question, yeah, I think all of the entity from social forestry program and also others have opportunity. Sorry, Vitkap, which question? Sorry, maybe I missed.
Yeah, the question was related to whether social forestry licenses, HTI, HPH licenses, they can also participate in generating carbon and having carbon revenue.
Yeah, of course. It is clearly regulated in policy, in carbon pricing policy. I think because it will all sector under NDC will have opportunity to participate in carbon market. So regarding the, for example, regarding the social forestry program, right now there are a lot of projects in small scale, in local level, assisted by NGO, how they can involve in voluntary market, in international voluntary market. Of course, at this point, we would like to how we can corridorize to manage. By provide them domestic market. So long as the program is under the NDC, they have to, the first thing that they have to follow the NDC target. As I mentioned earlier, that if they want to participate in international market, they have to make sure that the program is outside of Indonesia NDC. So I think all the sector under NDC have opportunity to participate in carbon market, I think.
Okay, thank you. There's a very interesting comment from Jamal Gawi about there is a potential role of carbon market to support community forestry initiatives. He says that he's seen one success in Jambi. I think it's very interesting because especially in the current situation like COVID-19 situation where the communities are the ones who are suffering when it comes to economic times, if these kind of funds and carbon money can reach the communities and can help them during these kind of times, it's a very interesting comment. So I take note of that. With that, I will ask attendees to maybe raise hands if they have live questions and directly ask the questions to panel members. Maybe we'll start with Forum International. Paul?
You may have to demute him.
Yes,
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Paul Hall. I'm founder of Forum International. I was invited by GGGI to share some of our experience in the large-scale restoration investments we do in Africa. And very interesting to hear where Indonesia is now with I would say the legal framework and the enabling environment. I just want to share a couple of things which might be a nice parallel to what you are in today in Indonesia. We started in 2000 with a short pilot in Ghana in a restoration concession, similar type of license as is today in Indonesia, to explore large-scale landscape restoration of a degraded forest concession. And at that time, the legislation was not completely elaborated, but we started the pilot just to see if technically and also in terms of the stakeholders, it was possible to set up the project. Only in 2007 we were able to sign long-term land leases and to start the large-scale restoration investment. Very briefly, where are we today? We have been able to manage now about 20,000 hectares in Ghana and Tanzania. It's all about restoration of degraded lands in forest concessions or agricultural lands. We employ about 2,500 people, and we have invested about $60 million US. Now, coming back to Indonesia and to what I know in the last 2 years, we are exploring a little bit our services because my firm is involved in forestry services and investment services. And what we see is that what we did in Ghana was, it was not only a plantation investment purely on leased lands with the Forestry Commission of Ghana, but we were invited by the communities around that area to work on a 100,000 hectare landscape restoration project. So you see there, it was a combination of commercial investments plus building the bridge to the neighbors and to the communities. So we have today steering committees where we have the local government involved, the communities, the private sector, and that was a way to accelerate investments in landscape restoration. On the topic of investment, as Lisa mentioned and others mentioned already, it was very much related to blended finance. So the initial investment came from a private investment firm, but then we were able to attract money from African Development Bank, various governments, foundations, and so forth. So is it very quickly, because there's not much time, but what I hear today, there's a very good policy in Indonesia. There's a strong willingness to provide incentives for private investments. And I would say, if you are able to set up pilots now to make it technically more concrete, but also to bring a business case to a mature level, meaning that in terms of land tenure, in terms of legal aspects, risks, and so forth, please work on that in pilots. That is at least my experience, because it makes things much more concrete. When we started in Ghana, there was not a very clear message in the sense of land lease and revenue share. We could only sign with the government, with the central government on land lease. Later on, that concept was changed into a concept where you sign directly with the local landowners or communities around the area, and where you pay direct revenue share. This is just an example. And looking back now, if in 2000 we were still waiting for the final completion of all the legal frameworks and enabling environment, I think we were never been able to start that investment. So I would say a development phase is fundamental in a pilot to overcome these obstacles and to make an investment more mature for institutional investors or any other investor who is interested. So this is something which we can share. There's a lot of information available. Not to say that the concept of Ghana can be copied to Indonesia, that will never happen. But at least I like to bring in the message that if you have concrete pilots on large tracts of land with a right stakeholder involvement from the beginning, you can work on that process and create the right environment for your investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That's a great share, I would say. I would call on the participants if anyone wants to raise their hand and we ask a question to. We have Brad from ADB. Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, thank you, panelists. It's been a very stimulating discussion. From a development bank point of view, I'm interested to get some insights into what role the panelists think that the development banks could play in helping to de-risk some new sustainable landscape initiatives or scale some of the more proven initiatives. Are there any examples that would be ready to go, or is there a lot of further groundwork that needs to be done before that could take place? And finally, I know there's an agency called the Peatland Restoration Agency, and I was just wondering, perhaps through Ibu Nia, whether you could elaborate on whether that is continuing as an agency and how that possibly links in with BPDLR. Thank you.
I will, let's go ground up. Maybe Robert, you can answer the question, Brad's question about what development bank could help you achieve.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's a really good one. For me, it depends a lot on what ticket sizes development banks would be interested in. In our phase, where we're trying to prove a business model, as Paul pointed out, which is the first step that you need to do to attract larger investments. We're looking for significant money, but not really large tickets. So the 3,000 hectares we're trying to implement now, we're looking for 5 million euros in total. If that would be anything that a development bank would be interested in, then we should definitely talk. But my experience is that development banks normally look at much larger ticket sizes. So that for me is the key question. If development banks can set up facilities where they would be prepared to help early stage cases off ground, that would be fantastic. But so far, I haven't come across that.
Lisa, you have a comment?
Yeah, I do. Thanks very much, Bradley, for that comment. And I always am happy to to jump into this question. I mean, development banks, I think, have a really significant role in this context in terms of de-risking these types of investments and not just competing with the private sector, but really working to encourage the private sector, to leverage the private sector to step into these more challenging types of land use investments. I do see that often there's a sort of a concern about risk in the sector, particularly in the land use sector, where you have many players and again many partnerships, and there isn't a lot of clarity. But again, having a sort of a DFI be willing to take some of that risk for the private sector, to be that first mover, rather than just looking for the larger, safer opportunities. I see that will be extremely important in the future. That you can, help lower cost curves and alter risk perceptions for the private sector, helping to build sort of new platforms of these sort of opportunities. But it's kind of I guess, an alteration in terms of thinking about the role of DFIs in this sector. But there is, I see opportunity in abundance for DFIs and the opportunity to play a sort of leadership role that I'm not seeing at the moment. And we need to normalize this type of development as an investment thesis, really, and push the rest of us forward with the sort of bold leadership and strong signaling that I don't see from the DFIs at the moment. So thank you for that question.
Kalian di mana, Mbak? Coba nah, positif corona, Mbak.
Yeah, thank you. Bunia, the question about BRG is to you.
Regarding the BPDLH, right? The
BPDLH. Well, one, whether BRG,
BRG
is it continuing and going forward, what the role will be, and also what the BPDLH and BRG role could be, how could they work together?
Regarding the BRG, I'm not really know the information, but as I know that the task of the BRG will be extended, but I think it's still under discussion in high level among the within Ministry of Environment and Forestry. But as I know, it will be extended the function of the BRG. And then how the BRG and BPDLH can work or collaborate together at this point, I think both of institutions have a task or role to finding other sources for environmental fund, including climate finance. And also the BRG is also have I think role to find finance sources from outside. So I think maybe I refer to the, as I'm not wrong, Lisa give a kind of recommendation how the BPDLH can issue the bonds, particularly the bonds for sustainable land-based program. So I think at this point between BRG and BPDLH, can collaborate. How BPDLH can issue the bonds maybe intended for program of sustainable land-based program or particularly in peatland restoration program. I think this is one of the opportunity, but I think there are a lot of opportunity. But this is the thing that already starting in this term. So I think we can continue what we have done in the earlier. I think that's all.
Okay, Marcel, you want to come in?
Yeah, maybe I can add to that. I fully agree with Ibu, about this. I think in my presentation I showed that the risk of doing nothing is huge, particularly in the peatland landscapes, where Indonesia will be facing economic losses in terms of $10 to $20 billion per fire season during El Nino years, but also up to $5 billion per year if nothing is if there's no El Nino. So even in normal years, there are major economic losses incurred as a result of these degraded landscapes. So what better than to issue bonds to forego such costs and to entice investment, particularly also private investment, to come into these landscapes, both from companies, but also assisting smallholders, local communities in making investments in sustainable management of these areas and in restoration. I think BRG has a key role there to play in terms of coordinating such efforts, identifying priorities, identifying opportunities for investors to come in, but also in handing or providing investment models, both at the commodity level, but also investment models at the landscape level. I think a lot of investments have been made over the last years in that. Also, the government of Indonesia is strongly supporting this. They've established a new legislative requirement for provincial peatland planning, for peatland management and restoration planning. Central Kalimantan is now already involved in this kind of planning, where peatland restoration is taken to the jurisdictional level. But as Lisa has mentioned, we need upfront funding. It's not just results-based money, but we need upfront funding to help share risks for entrepreneurs that come into this arena. And again, I'm not just talking about the large-scale companies and also the medium-scale companies that we also have around the table here. I'm also talking about small-scale companies and communities, cooperatives that need support. And one of the things that is missing at the moment in this whole equation is how to create microfinance opportunities for communities. Again, we need to have clarity on tenure then, but also the mechanisms are not there. There's some funding mechanisms from government, so public funding for communities, but banks hardly have any microfinance available. Maybe there's also one of the things that Bradley can look at from the ADB, where development banks, I think, should partner with local national banks to establish microfinance mechanism to help de-risk microfinance mechanism and act as guarantee funds for such microfinance. So microfinance could become available in the landscape sector, and particularly for communities, to play an active role at reasonable costs and reasonable risks to such communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. I am looking at the time. Maybe we can have one last question. If anyone has, please do raise your hand and I'll call you in. No? Going one. Okay, Trita. Yep, last question. Please go ahead.
Yep, I have a question to Robert. So I note that your timber business model takes about 8 years, was it, for the class?
Trita, sorry to interrupt. Can you please just quickly introduce yourself, which organization you're representing as well?
My name is Trita. I'm from the Canadian Embassy in Jakarta. Yeah, okay, and my question is to Robert. I'm interested to know what type of business transactions that made it work in your case, that attracted investors to invest in your business, knowing that it will take 8 years to be profitable. So did you need a third party to come in and provide guarantees? And was it a blended finance transactions? And what was it that made it attractive for the investors?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Trita. It's a tricky one, and we're still fundraising. So as I said, we're looking at 5 million euros that we need to fully implement that showcase we're currently working on. And we're still fundraising. The money we raised so far is blended money. There's some equity from some high net worth individuals. There is a soft loan from another high net worth individual, and there are 2 grants that we got from a private foundation and from IDH. So it's a mixture. And this is actually what we are also looking for, this kind of blended finance, especially at that stage where we're at, because as I mentioned before, we're still trying to deliver the proof. We're very confident that we can do that in the next couple of years, but there are still some risks to be dealt with. And we need to work with investors that understand these risks and are patient enough. Yeah, the last thing that I would need is somebody who's asking me every half year when he gets his money back. So these kind of business models really need patient capital, and they need blended finance to make them work.
Thank you, Robert. I think we're gonna close the session, but before everyone goes away, we have recorded the session, so we'll be sharing the recording as well with everyone. We will share Marcel's presentation in PDF format with everyone as well. I'd like to just conclude by a couple of key takeaways from my side. I think it was a really interesting and good panel. Thank you again for all the panelists for taking out the time. I know I promised to keep it in 1.5 hours, but was not able to. But I take that as a positive because it means to me that it was a very engaging discussion. I'll quickly mention a couple of things, key takeaways. I think Marcel mentioned one very interesting point, that the opportunity costs of inaction are really, really huge. And so for everyone involved who are in this sector, it's really, that's the business case. The opportunity costs itself are the business cases. Number two, what Ibu Nia said, as well as I believe Lisa also mentioned, building partnerships between government as well as private sector to finally make sure that the community inclusiveness is there and the projects are working towards making livelihoods for the communities. Number third, I think Marcel also mentioned about the sharing of risks, and Ibu Nia also confirmed that, you know, the design of BPDLH should probably be taking care of sharing of risk and encouraging investments in Indonesia, whether it is upfront investment, results-based payment. Different instruments can be used, however, risk perception has to be lowered. And final takeaway, what Robert also ended with, basically the need for patient capital. I think for all the financiers, whether it is the entire gamut, whether it is development finance, whether it is impact capital, which is available in Southeast Asia, I think patient capital really plays a big role in development stage of the projects and programs. And the more there is, the better it is, because it really catalyzes the entire market to build up that pipeline of bankable projects, which all of us know is really hard to build. It has to start from the early stage development, in my point of view. And that's why the patient capital and early stage development capital is very much required. With that, Marcel, if you can close the session, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think you summarized it quite well, and of course there's a lot more that could be said in a summary. But yeah, we've come to the end of this session. I would like to thank all the panel members for the time and efforts made to make this a really interesting occasion. And thank you everybody, all the participants, for participating in this meeting and listening in. It shows also that I think that in this period of COVID-19, we can still have very fruitful discussions, and I hope that this can create a basis for further thought in the agencies where we all come from, as well as in the government, to look at the opportunities as well as the needs in the landscape sector, and to optimize, make optimal use of these opportunities. Clearly a lot of progress is being made by the Indonesian government, but they need all our support, both from private sector as well as from public agencies. So with that, let's close this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much,
Thank
Marcel.
you.
Big help.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thanks
Yeah.
so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Edward. Thank you,
Bye.
Munia.
Thank you, Fika. Thank you,
Thank
Pak
you,
Marcel.
Vico.
Yeah.